Welcome back, Sebastian here. So moving into the top 5 teams in the Constructors' Championship, today we'll be taking a look at Aston Martin. So for Aston Martin, I feel it's been a bit of a disappointing season. After how strongly things went in 2023, I think there were definitely quite high expectations that the Silverstone-based team would be able to stay with that top group. Unfortunately, it hasn't really been the case, and it kind of has been getting worse as the season has gone along. First, let's take a look at their drivers and their head-to-head stats against one another. So the two drivers, again, same lineup from 2023, Alonso and Stroll. But I think a lot of the stats are definitely not as overwhelmingly in Alonso's favor the way that they were last year. Starting with qualifying, Alonso leads there 9-5 with a median qualifying delta of 0.194 seconds. And then for average starting position, 9.29 for Alonso and 11.76 for Stroll. So Alonso is still ahead in the qualifying, do it head-to-head, but definitely not as dominant as he was last year. Part of this is probably Alonso getting a little bit older. Part of this is Stroll perhaps being a bit more comfortable after definitely being on the back foot for the start of 2023 with those broken wrists. I also feel like towards the mid part of the season last year, Aston Martin brought some upgrades to the car that made the car incredibly difficult to drive, very unstable, and I think that just made the gap in qualifying much worse, whereas this year it doesn't really feel like that's been as much of an issue. So all things I think have contributed to qualifying being a little bit closer this year. When we look at average finishing position and points, again, a bit closer than last year. So average finishing position 11.56 for Alonso, for Stroll 11.27. So honestly, Alonso's not that much further ahead than Stroll. But again, because of the way the structure is this year, Alonso's basically, realistically, in any given weekend, his best possible result is a 9th place finish. And for Stroll, he hasn't been awful, but again, the Aston Martin I think is a little bit stronger car than the Haas, the RBs. They're kind of in no man's land where they're kind of not really, there's no one who's really fighting around their exact spot. So again, it makes sense that their finishing positions would be a little bit closer. For points, 49 for Alonso, 24 for Stroll, 9th and 10th in the Drivers' Championship, kind of like what I was just alluding to. Again, you would look at their whole body of work and looking at how the gap between Alonso and Stroll, and generally there would be a couple positions in the Drivers' Championship separating them, but again, because they're the teams basically no man's land this year, that's 9th and 10th right next to each other. But that being said, over the course of the whole season, I do feel like Alonso's definitely been the better driver. I think Alonso's not quite having the same season he did last year, again, with the car being a lot worse on average. It's definitely hard to tell because, again, no podiums, but again, with the car, no podiums would be expected anyway. But, for averaging out my power rankings for this season, 9.9 for Alonso, which comes out to 9th, is behind Hülkenberg, so again, not the best driver in that bottom group of teams. But I do still feel like he's had a good season. But again, there's been some mistakes creeping in here and there. For Stroll, 13.5, which is 15th. So again, not at the bottom. He's, again, not one of those bottom drivers, Joe Sargent. I think he's been generally having a pretty quietly, by his standards, a good year. Still not a great season. But generally, the absolute disaster weekends, where he crashes out, he's out qualified by like a second. Those weekends have definitely been kept to a minimum this year, and he's generally just been chipping away, being out qualified by a tenth or two, and then finishing 1 or 2 positions behind, 10 seconds down the road from Alonso in the races. So again, not an absolute awful season for Stroll. For points above expected, again, both drivers in the negative, and this is something that's generally across the board. Most drivers were in the negative when I calculated this, and again, I think it's because there's less DNFs. So again, for a lot of teams, there's less opportunities to get random big points finishes that they would have in past years. But negative 4.78 for Alonso, negative 6.17 for Stroll, and when you convert that to percentages, for Alonso 91%, for Stroll 80%. So again, Alonso is still making better use of his starting position, again being getting more points compared to Stroll than you would expect. Now moving into the Aston Martin, the constructor, and again, this is where things are a little bit worrying. So 2021, last year, the regulations, of course, this was coming off their really strong 2020, and again, with the floor regulations, there was all the talk about how it hurt the low rate teams, blah blah blah, from what we're talking about all season. And again, with Vettel's first year in the team, finished 7th in the constructors, 77 points. Again, definitely a step back from the year before. Average pole gap 1.384 seconds, and average minimum finishing position 8.91. Then we get to 2022, first year of the new regulations, and the first car that they came out, which was the car they had for basically the first half of the season, was an absolute disaster. It was very, very slow. It was terrible in qualifying. They were routinely the second worst team in qualifying for most of that season, but again, they were able to turn it around in the second half of the season. Ended up finishing 7th, 55 points, so again, still ended up 7th despite a lot less points. Average pole gap 1.937, which again, for that season as a whole, was still the second worst total. And for average minimum finishing position, again, a step back from 2021, 9.67 seconds. So again, the second half of 2022 was actually quite good. Vettel was generally scoring points at a pretty regular rate. And again, there was hope for 2023 that they would be on a bit of an upward trajectory. And the hope was that they would be fighting Alpine, they'd be fighting McLaren in that kind of battle for 4th place. And that was kind of generally the best case scenario. But again, I think we got to 2023 and 23, and I think at least for the start, things were much better than expected. You can make a very good argument that the Aston Martin was the second best car for the opening quarter of the season. It's just that the Red Bull was so strong that unfortunately it was not really able to win any races. But yeah, as the season went along, the development race definitely became a challenge, and they definitely started kind of falling backwards, and they were basically caught by McLaren towards the end of the season in the constructors as well. Ended up finishing 5th, so again, bit of a disappointment. And again, I think I did some analysis at the end of last year where I think you can make a really good argument that Stroll cost them 1 position in the constructors, but not more than that. So I think realistically, 4th was probably, based on how things were going, that was probably realistically the best position that they could have gotten, but because of Stroll's really pretty weak season, they only end up finishing 5th. 280 points, average pole gap 0.774 seconds, an average minimum finishing position of 5.43. So again, pole gap was better, definitely a big improvement from 2022, but again, it was something that generally got worse as the season went along. Same with the average minimum finishing position. 2024, 5th in the constructors. So again, as of the recording of this video, same rank in the constructors that they were last year, but of course with a much worse car. 73 points so far. Again, they're probably on pace for about 120, 130 points when it's all said and done. So again, still less than half of what they had last year, but at least the one bright spot is that they'll still get the same prize money for finishing 5th. Pole gap 0.753 seconds, so actually an improvement from last year on average. But again, very similar to last year. Started the season, first 6 races. Qualifying was actually very, very strong. They were just within that top group. And again, with the race pace, it definitely they fell back a bit in the races. But now qualifying is not where it was those first 6 races. So now they're definitely not in that top qualifying group. So I would expect this is a number that's going to, again, continue to get worse as the season goes along. Average minimum finishing position 8.43, so again, much worse than last year, but better than 2021 and better than 2022. Again, talking about the development race, compared to races 1 to 6, so my quarter season review, for average starting position, average finishing position for Alonso, 6.75 and 11.38 for Stroll. So again, for both metrics, those are numbers are going in the wrong direction. So it looks like they're generally falling behind in development compared to the teams around them. And now, they're definitely, it seems like week in, week out, they're really in the mix with RB, in the mix with Haas. And again, I don't think those teams will be able to catch Aston Martin in the constructors unless one of them has some massive upgrade that really pushes them into even fighting that top group that would allow them to get enough points to battle to kind of match Aston Martin. And again, with finishing position, a bit of a different story. 8.71 for Alonso, which so again, almost 2 positions worse. So again, he's had some rough weekends since I did that video. For Stroll, 12.33. So actually for Stroll, he's improved by almost a position, and for Alonso has fallen back by almost 2 positions. So again, bit of a mixed bag there with the finishing position results. And again, something that we saw last year, and again we're seeing it this year, is a trend of a downgrade. So instead of upgrades being added to the car, the upgrades that the team has been bringing to the car, the first set of upgrades, around the European season, and even now towards near the end of the European leg. Again, they seem to be making the car slower and not be making the car quicker. So it definitely seems like there's some kind of issues internally in the Aston Martin team that is generally, I think, holding them back from really, pushing forwards and consistently being in that fight for the front, despite, I think having a very good driver in Alonso, and again, having a lot of budget behind them at the factory. Of course, they're going to be running for the same lineup for 2025. I think they could have improved that if they really wanted, ambitious with working towards 2026. Carlos Sainz was an option again. Would have been pretty interesting to have an all Spanish lineup. Other than that, you had drivers like Gasly, drivers like Ocon, and again Tsunoda with those Honda links, I think could definitely be a driver who I think the team may be targeting in the future. If that's whether that's replacing Alonso or whether that's replacing Stroll is yet to be seen. But again, watch for Tsunoda, especially next year, with it being Honda's last year in the Red Bull family, and again with Honda coming in 2026. Look for those connections between Tsunoda and Aston Martin to start heating up next year. And again, there's the question of Adrian Newey as well. He's still, a free agent, still on the market. No one has officially, signed him for next year when he will be available after, that very strange negotiating with the gardening leave where he'll be available at the start of 2025. Really, it seems like Aston and Ferrari are the two favorites, but again, it seems for the last month or so like it's trending towards Aston Martin. So again, that would be a very big signing. And again, sometimes it's hard to tell with these off-track staff, what kind of impact they actually make on the car. But again, with Adrian Newey, he's won basically everywhere he's gone. He won at Red Bull, won at McLaren, won at Williams. So again, he has a track record of success in F1 that goes back for decades. So again, that would be a massive win for Aston Martin if they were able to bring him in. But again, we'll see how things go for the second half of the season. Again, they're kind of locked into 5th place in the Constructors, so they're not really in any kind of intense battle. And again, they're just going to be wanting to, I think definitely with the car upgrades, they're going to be wanting to make sure that the parts they bring on the car are actually making the car faster. And again, they just want to get as many good results as possible to finish out the season and push into 2025. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.